We're setting up also. Our book did come out. It came out quite some time ago. This is what it looks like as a volume. You're very welcome to have a look at it later. We give details on the handout of its availability. It was a project of love of a few years ago of looking at the Sangiorgesi community, supported by the Sangiorgio Club of South Australia.
Ormai lo sangue mio sta qua, figlio mio sta qua, nipote mi stanno qua, moglie me dopo è venuta qua, dico, mo mi stanno qua. E diciamo a noi, dove cade lo ciuccio, si chiamano le carciofe.
Io sono contenta di stare qua. Ho la famiglia, ho 4 figli, ho 10 nipoti, una nipote già sposata, siamo tutti riuniti, solo mio marito sta un poco dispiaciuto perché sta solo, ma ormai sono 80 anni.
Thank you for listening and staying for this particular piece. We're going to be talking about the diaspora of the Sangiorgesi from San Giorgio La Molara, which is a little village, wasn't so little once upon a time, in the Benevento area in Campania, around about there, and 150 kilometres from Pompeii. And we're going to be talking about the migration, which is now almost 100 years. In 2027 marks the 100th anniversary of the first 8 men who came to South Australia from San Giorgio. And since that time, and the migration happened from 1927 to around about 1970. Since that time, there are about 4,000 people who came from this particular village. So it's a microcosm, yes, but it was a massive, massive migration from one particular village to Adelaide, and not to Melbourne, few around in other states, as you'll hear in a moment, but mainly to South Australia. As the people who previously spoke, the stories are sometimes similar, but also the person who spoke, Agnesi, I think, who talked about the club, and other people who, the Ballarat Club. The San Giorgio La Molara community established itself in 1979 for the first time, bought some property, made a fortune, paid for it, and paid for us to publish this work, which took 5 years. And basically what we did is we interviewed people, we collected photographs, and we wrote a history of ordinary people, basically. And Angela will talk a little bit more about that. But we're really interested today in talking, Mrs. Adelaide obviously, it's how people understand the diaspora. Where is this Sangiorgesi community? And particularly, that's what we'll talk about in the first part. In the second part, we're going to talk about the historiography, the methodology, and in the third part, we really want to talk about what the Global was talking about. You know, we want to talk about the current 3 generations. What kind of handle do we get on the current 3 generations of Italians, the 1950s onwards, to find out how they might be travelling, and you know, what is it that makes them feel a connection, and what of the future. So we're trying to look at, and to go back to Rita's talk, I suppose, we're trying to look at the spaces. So we're trying to come up from the top and sort of come into the humanities and into the people, and to have a look at, so this is where they dispersed. So the first question is, how might the lived experiences of those who left Italy, San Giorgio La Molara, for South Australia, be understood? And that's what's documented in this book. So we decided you can't do everything. We decided to interview some people of those who decided to leave, those that decided to leave and come. So the first question is really about that. And it is a story that starts in 1927 with these 8 men that came. And you have to understand, of course, that they came in 1927, 2 years before the Great Depression. And therefore, these were single men, some of them who had been, you know, some of them who are 30-year-olds, some of them are 18-year-olds, and they'd come out because of poverty, the whip of poverty, but basically because of adventure as well. And they'd come into a place which doesn't become the promised land, not for a while. And it takes them a while to get their wives and their children, some of them, out to South Australia. So the first 8 men, and I'll give you an example of one in a moment, the first 8 men come out in 1927. They bring their families over before the war, generally before the beginning of the war. And then there's hardly anything happening, and of course then there's the droves that come in the 1950s and the 1960s, and in the times of economic boom, both here and in Italy, of course. Let me give. Let's go back a bit. Let's give you one example. One example of the typography of settlement, if you like, and what we have written, how we've written this book, is we've talked about people, the leaving. So these are the chapter headings, if you like, the leaving, the stories about deciding to leave, arriving, fear, apprehension, dislocation about war. Then the initial living, the initial years, boarding, work, education, language, you've got the idea, I think. Then returning, which is, happens in the 1960s mainly, importantly to understand oneself, to go and see family, to sell up, to go for a holiday, but resignation as well, to grow, to become, to see that they are not part of that, but part of another diaspora. And the reflecting of life, and I think the person who spoke about the medical situation talked about the fatalism, but there was a lot of positivism as well as the fatalism, and the reflection is very important in this, on life, on friends, with children, nursing home, death, burial and that kind of thing. And lastly, this particular book talks about the connections that people have still with Italy, or this community has with Italy. And in a way of understanding some of that, we can't do everything today, of course, we're going to give you the story sketched out of Ida La Falce. Ida is that person in the middle there, and she was born in 1927, is exactly when the first date came out. But she was born, she was 2 months old in 1927 when her father, Mariano Marciano, left to come to Adelaide. He was one of the 8. And of course we couldn't speak to any of the people who were in that 8 because they had all passed. So we had to speak to someone from their family. And we spoke to Ida. Ida was the informant. And she tells us that she was 2 months when her father left, and he came to Adelaide. And he found it difficult in Adelaide. He found, as I said, the Great Depression, but he also found it difficult to find work, and we don't quite know how much of his personality, but I think you might get an idea in a moment. He goes out and cuts, the bushland in the early 1930s. He goes to the sugarcane area and tries his luck there, but he ends up at Halls Creek digging gold, right? So Halls Creek, for those people who don't know, is in Western Australia, right at the top, and lives in a tent, right? Just before the war breaks out, he goes back to Italy in 1938. Ida, by this stage, is 11 years old, and she's in the village. She's 11, and her father comes at the precise time that with some means from the country, and she's allowed, therefore, to continue her education in the village, and she gets a few more years of education thanks to her father. Her father then leaves again, feels that something is in the air and he will go. He goes back to Australia and leaves mother, Concetta, Epifanio and Ida in Italy. It's not till 1949, when Concetta and Ida and her brother are basically summoned to come over to Australia. And Ida, by this time, is 21, and she's engaged to be married. She doesn't want to go, but she eventually does go. She lands in Perth. They wait there for 5 days, because they're on the way to Halls Creek, right? So she's in Perth. She goes to Broome. She gets on a 5-seater plane. She goes then on the 5-seater seat a plane. She lands in Halls Creek. There's a creek that she tells about. She has to take off her blue shoes and she has to try to walk across with the bags and all of this kind of stuff. And she sees some Aboriginal people. She's absolutely petrified of the Aboriginal people. And eventually she, they live in this tent with her mother and her brother. And she learns, she's 21, she's not young, she's 21. She learns to go out gold hunting and prospecting, and she has she begins to have a different kind of relationship with the Aboriginal people, and she talked quite glowingly about how the friendships that she had. When she comes to about 1951, she wants to bring over her fiancé, and her fiancé, she can't, because she's a woman, she's the sponsor. It takes her 3 applications to get her fiancé to Australia, whereas her brother Epifanio, who also gets his bride from Sangiorgesi, first pop, he's in. So anyway, Nazareno arrives in Melbourne, takes the plane over to Perth. They get married in Perth, and then they go up to Halls Creek, and they stay there for quite a while, and they have children, and one of them is Vera, and the other one, I don't know the name. But anyway, they had 2 children. They had 2 children there, and this is a picture of where they are at that point. And during the 50s, they stay in the northern part of prospecting and doing that kind of thing. And Nazareno gets a council job, and eventually they come down to Perth. And in the 1950s, they shift home about 4 or 5 times. Carnarvon, another place. And she runs a chicken farm of 2,500 chickens, obviously free range, that kind of stuff. Anyway, she manages to be able to do that. And they live in Perth. Meanwhile, father, Marciano, who's up in the goldfields, in 1953, his wife's had enough. They decide to come to Adelaide, and they drove their donkeys, literally, this is what they told us, literally to Adelaide. So they arrive in Adelaide, they stay 2 or 3 months in Adelaide, and then they're off back to Sangiorgesi. And where eventually Marciano dies at the age of 70, and then mother is left alone because all her family's in Perth. So mother comes back to Perth and stays with her son. By this stage, Ida has gone to Adelaide with her husband and lives her life from the 1960s, 1970s, and died only 2 years ago, 2016. And her husband, Nazareno, is still alive, and he's 89 and having his feast in the club, obviously. What that story, if you'd like to read it, it's in sort of the kind of oral history. The way we've presented it is it's like the back of those. That's why we've sent you that little bit of a flyer. It's sort of like in poetic form for particular reasons, and it is trying to be faithful to the language. And we'll talk a little bit more about the language. It talks about that story epitomises the diaspora, the Sangiorgesi in one way, but it also talks about the leaving, the living, the returning, and where we're at. What we'll come back to after Angela talks about the methodology of this is the 1950s on. In other words, not either story, but we are interested in how we're going to get a handle on Vera, who was born in 1951-52, her son, who was born in the 1970s, and their son. So we've now got 3 generations, one generation, the next, and our grandchildren. And we're really interested in working out how we're living and melding, and how some of it is disappearing.
We were interested very much in producing a history, and as we heard earlier, a history not just of this particular community, but also a history that is part of the history of South Australia. And we have in fact done presentations to the Historical Society along those lines. We wanted to work through, and the way that we worked this was to conduct a series of interviews, individual interviews with with families of the first 8 people who had come to South Australia, and then group interviews around particular themes with about 30 people. We did not seek to present a chronology. Let me say that the community expected exactly that. They expected that we would interview them and that we would present their story as a chronological affair. But we did not want to present a chronology. Our approach was historical, with a view of history that assumes fluidity of time and a seamlessness between past, present and future. Following Griffiths, who sees history as that unending dialogue between present and past, which is essential to human consciousness. It is conducted as a part of the daily business of living, of knowing oneself, of grappling with memory and finding meaning. So it was a history based on what the Sangiorgesi wanted to say about their experiences and to recognise and value their testimonies. And so the history is basically a reflective recollection, reordered through written and visual narratives in an attempt to better understand who we are as individuals and who they were as individuals and as a community. So our project was not one of historical truth, but one of faithfulness. It was a project of understanding. And following Gadamer, the German philosopher who inspires our work, all understanding is historical. As Gadamer says, history does not belong to us, we belong to it. Long before we understand ourselves through the process of self-examination, we understand ourselves in a self-evident way in the family, society and the state in which we live. The self-awareness of the individual is only a flickering in the closed circuits of historical life. We did not want a grand narrative, therefore, but rather than that, understanding who we were, who we are and who we are becoming for each of the individuals involved and for the community as a whole. We chose the narrative form. It was an oral history project. And narrative is a particularly fruitful approach as it allows for precisely the movement across time. We focused on narratives drawing on the mental archives of individuals. We also did source other kinds of archives, but it was the mental archives of individuals that we were interested in. The value of narrative resides in the fact that they offer an account, a recollection, a memory of the past which is retold in the present. And here we observe with Recur this double sense of narrative. And I quote, "We would say that there are 2 sorts of time in every story told. On the one hand, a discrete succession that is open and thematically indefinite, a series of incidents, for we can always pose the question, and then, and then, and then. On the other hand, the story told presents another temporal aspect characterised by the integration, culmination and closure, owing to which the story receives a particular configuration. In this sense, composing a story is, from the temporal point of view, drawing a configuration out of the succession." That is precisely what we wanted to do. We elicited the stories from our participants, individuals and groups. In the group interviews, sometimes they contradicted each other, they disagreed. Of course, disagreement is lively and fruitful. And out of that, there's the sense that each one was reconfiguring their own understanding of their own life. And for us, we were then trying to reconfigure again in a narrative form that we chose to use because we wrote it as another narrative, not a meta-narrative, but another narrative that combined the narratives of our participants. So the first source of data was these series of oral histories that we were able to elicit. The first of the family of the first set of people who had come, the first 8, and then others that covered the post-World War II period. In addition to covering the individual lives, the themes that we were interested in included the interwar years, the war, education, the New World, church, working in the factories, social class, language, and the experiences of those who had migrated after the 1970s. In addition to the oral narratives that we captured, we also had a process for capturing visual testimonies. Here we simply invited people to bring their albums, photo albums, to the club on a series of evenings, and to tell us about 2 or 3 photos that they had chosen from their albums. The book contains 350 photos of different people. It was also a way that we had of including a wider number of participants. We interviewed 30 plus, but we needed to include a lot more. Of course, this kind of work, both in the spoken narratives and in the visual narratives, we considered a number of issues, one of which, of course, is the relationship between memory, narrative identity and historical truth. Of course, I've already mentioned that in this type of work, this is an issue, and some people fear it. We actually embraced it because we were not looking for truth, capital T, but we were looking at the truth according to their own sentiments. It's how they saw things, how they experienced things, and to come as close as possible as we could to that. And so we followed the work of Passerini, who says it is the concern of oral history to support and try to practice a historiography that shall be a conscious construction from the standpoint of the present of a past that is shaped by this reinterpretation, that, thanks to the effort of subjectivity, shall also return the object to what it really is and wants to be. Oral history is concerned with establishing memory as a narrating act and symbolic mediation, to be studied in its diverse historical and social manifestations, discovering the discontinuities, contradictions, inertia, but also the creativity and fidelity of memory as an individual act in social contexts, may be a contribution towards broadening and humanising the concept of historical truth. So that's how we actually reconciled in our own minds that memory itself is very selective. What do we choose to remember? What do we choose to leave behind? Memory is also, and the narrative form itself, is for an audience. So the teller will not only tell the story as he or she recollects it, but will tell the story in a way that is going to be appropriate for the audience. It's an interactive kind of accomplishment. And so the value of narrative is that it gives some sense of order to experience. But the emphasis is on some sense of. It is unashamedly subjective. There are also naturally contradictions, plenty of them, and particularly because we were working with groups. And so it's basically the historical take that we took is a history that relies on memory, interpretation, mediation, and representation. There were numerous contradictions across the participants. Our goal was to seek to understand their way of seeing and perceiving their own experience. In writing, and we debated this for a long time, in the actual writing, what were we going to do? The community did expect individual profiles and their story represented. There was no doubt about that. It became somewhat controversial. We decided to write in the first person plural. We wanted to weave together multiple narratives, not necessarily of any particular individuals, but the voices of individuals are certainly there. So because it is a history about the personal narratives of individuals and the collective narrative of a community of people living in diaspora within a wider community of Australians, we chose, in order to give a sense of community, to use the first person plural form. So we said, as the title says, we left. Well, sometimes the we is we as the narrators of the whole piece. Sometimes the we refers to the 8 first people who migrated, sometimes other people. But it was a device that gave a certain sense of immediacy. We also were conscious of multiple readers, and you will see in the extracts that we've quoted that we were as faithful as we could to to the language and readership. It needed to be in English and Italian, for starters. In addition, we were faithful to transcribing the actual words of the participants as they had given them. This includes a delicious mixture of standard Italian, English, Australo-Italian, every combination, and of course the Sangiorgesi dialect. We had fun with transcribing all of that. Where we provide these extracts in poetic form, as you can see in the handout, where it is in Italian for the English part, we convey that, we translate it. And so everything is available in both languages. The first half of the book is the story told in English. The second half of the book is the story told in Italian. The photographic narrative, however, changes across the work with the 350 images that I have actually mentioned. So that is basically our experimentation with form to try and give life to the work. What we are reflecting on now is how we would actually do it if we were doing it with the digital means that we might use now.
Okay, 5 minutes, okay? I know we are last, though. We were last, come on. So this slide, for the last bit, how might the lived experience of the current generations of Sangiorgesi, inverted commas now, because we don't quite know whether they are Sangiorgesi anymore, in South Australia be understood? And we're talking my generation. I was born here in Australia in 1951. Then my children and sort of my grandchildren grandchild in that kind of sense. So imagine. So this is sort of a methodology and sort of some observations we've got quickly. Imagine we're hovering now over Adelaide and we're coming down into modern space. And what we're going to be doing is really trying to, we think the methodology might be to have a look at those spaces in which we live, the peopled spaces, all those places in which we now are using, we're now living, basically. And we're talking about living, melding, our melding spaces and our disappearing spaces. So three comments, first of all. First comment is that you can look at space in the personal, sort of what's within myself, what's my imagination saying to me, my feelings, my inner conversations, it's how I feel. The second lot is familial, the family, our clan, my own clan, like myself, my family, my cousins, my relatives, my acquaintances, and all of those kinds of places. And the third one is the public, the wider public, but sort of the world. And that's, of course, become all very complicated now, where we don't know what space is because of the digital world. We don't know where we are, really, in some of the places. So an observation as we start about the 3 generations. The first observation is that no matter which generation you get, our experiences are projected on a wider canvas. This is a picture of one of the Sangiorgesi person here, and you know what this is about, right, Anzac? And you know, I mean, that's where this person came out in the 1930s, one of the sons of the first 8. He came out, he was 18 when it was in 1938. His father had to become naturalised. He therefore becomes an Australian soldier. He therefore goes to New Guinea, and here he is there. There he is there. But you know, so you don't get choices sometimes as a generation. You've got these economic, social, big picture stuff that you fall into, and that's in there. The second point about the second observation I'd like to make, or would like to make, is that every generation has got its coordinates. You know, our generation, the next generation, they've got different ways of thinking, different ways of seeing, different ways of experiencing gender and sexual relations, the world, the whole thing. And that's important when we're going down to these spaces. The third part is that, as Angela said, what we do is we think of time as present, past and future all being moulded into one. So when I'm thinking of something as a generation in my space, and I might be chatting around in a kitchen space with my family, that kind of space, doesn't mean that I'm in the present, because what I might be doing is going back to my past to bring something back to the present or going to the future. So these spaces are not just interestingly just today, yesterday, the day before, that kind of thing. And I think that's very important. The last thing we'd like to say, because I know it's late, is that language is the key, I think, to understanding where this diaspora is going. Therefore, you know, the global, interestingly, bilingual and all of that kind of stuff is very, very interesting. I mean, Kate Grenville, in her recent memoir of her mother, and I think it's a fascinating thing because, you know, sort of lots of the things that happen to that kind of person and that kind of social class happened to the Italians as well. But regardless, she talks about her mother, who became a pharmacist, learning French at school and feeling as if she had taken on a different soul when she brought on her language. And I think there's something in this. There's something in language and the ability in which languages the current generations and we are speaking that will help us understand what kind of diaspora we are now living in. I think the key will be the sense of language. And if you look through the book, the interesting thing is that if you study the language of the people, the ones that spoke to us, like the soldier who spoke to us, they do know their Sangiorgesi, but they chose to speak in English. The ones that came out in the 50s and the 60s spoke in Italian or dialect, and now, of course, they're in English with a smattering of words. It's fascinating. We're going to leave it there. Okay. Basically, anyway.
Thank you.
Thank you.